I want to talk about something that recently came out that has a lot of people in the security industry very opinionated, I'll put it that way. In case you haven't seen, NIST released a new set of password recommendations. And they've said things like, get rid of your complexity requirements. They actually don't help as much as you think. Start doing things like allowing spaces in passwords so that people can use full passphrases. Allow long passphrases, such as, like 60 plus characters. Allow Unicode and make that Unicode only take a single character width. These are things that I think are fairly common sense. However, a lot of people don't seem to think that. A lot of organizations that, a lot of them, let's be fair, are probably ISO certified, say, no, we must continue to use these backwards old, Netman passwords from the NT35 days because that's the way things have always been done. And in order to mollify those people, one of the big things that happened was NIST said, instead of you must, or even you should, you shall. And if anyone in here is a fan of that RFC, you know how wishy-washy that language is getting. So it feels like there's no teeth in this, which is great for executives who don't want to upset the apple cart and force everybody to change their passwords again. But for those of us who have to deal with what happens when there's a breach, we're not as big of a fan. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up to all of my friends here, and we're going to get into this. What do we think about NIST's new password guidelines? And should they be guidelines or should they be the password code?
I love the new password guidelines. There were the guidelines that we've already been considering as best practices for like 5+ years. So I like that they've codified it. NIST, though most of these frameworks are standards that are normative as in thou shalt for the federal government, but for the rest of us, it's take what you want that works for you and leave what you don't unless you're audited against it. So I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think the problem, though, is that, as you mentioned, for the government, it's thou shalt.
Yes.
And for everybody else, it's like thou shalt if you want to market yourself as having government-grade encryption or some stupid thing like that. Drew's giggling over here. He's like,
Drew's giggling.
Well, Tom, I think they're good. And I think the one thing that people don't necessarily talk about is these are all good best practices if you're enforcing MFA everywhere. And that's the kicker. And I think a lot of people that are hung up on, oh, we can't do this. It's either they haven't implemented MFA everywhere or they don't trust that their people have put MFA everywhere.
Speaking of which, if you're watching this right now and you don't have MFA enabled on all of your accounts, or you're using two-factor that requires you to get a text message, go fix that now.
Or you're not factoring in they have MFA or SSO, they prompt you and it needs to be in the organization, and then half or more don't have it set up or enabled.
Well,
and then it becomes...
We ran into this problem. If you are fans of the Gestalt IT Rundown that we publish every Wednesday afternoon, you already know that we've covered this a couple of times. If not, you should go check out gestaltit.com. But one of the things that we saw with Snowflake is they were getting a lot of their databases breached, like not Snowflake's databases, but the customers that use Snowflake. And their response was the typical, accountability, washing my hands of this. Well, we told them they needed to enable MFA and they didn't, and we have no way of doing that. And then there was some liability issues about, well, actually you do have that capability. And suddenly there was an update that happened like a week later where it's like, yes, we're going to enforce MFA across anybody who's using our databases. Turns out that when the lawyers get involved, a lot of things can get changed really fast. So kind of coming back to our topic about passwords, could it be in a situation where a company gets breached, a company needs to update their password policies, but there's something standing in the way, and finally a different department, say one that can involve people getting sued, says, nope, you've got to do it this way from here on out? Could that be the driver that we need?
Well, it could, but we've had conflicting, I think part of the challenge and part of the celebration about NIST change in the 863.4 update is that we've had like the discrepancy because certain other requirements like PCI DSS and HIPAA and everything that you guys have in Europe, sometimes there was misalignment with the password policies. Mm-hmm. And so if you needed to check the box on PCI DSS, it meant you had to follow whatever that guidance was, which might have been in conflict with one of the NIST standards or vice versa, actually vice versa in this case. So now they're just more in alignment, but I think people have to, organizations have to make the decision around which one they're going to justify with which case. And then sometimes certain devices and platforms don't support that, right? Not every platform supports 64 character long passwords.
Or there's certain characters that are marked invalid automatically, which means that platform is going to need to receive an update in order to comply with new policies. Yeah. Or my other favorite one is, oh, we're just never going to update that platform because it's like 5 years old at this point. And oh my God, that would be so expensive. You're going to have to buy a new thing if you want to support this. And I agree with you that the superseding requirements from things like PCI DSS or some of the DORA, GDPR, whatever you want to call it, take precedence. And do you think that those organizations are going to modify their frameworks and regulatory to accommodate for new guidelines from NIST that could potentially make their systems even more secure?
Yes, and I think they already did. So that's why I said it was kind of more vice versa, because NIST, is such a broad industry collaborative effort that it takes time, whereas PCI DSS is probably revved and updated several times since then. Mm-hmm. So they, the ones that get updated more often that are smaller scope tend to have these things worked in sooner, and then it takes NIST a little bit longer. And
it's easy when you're, scoping guidelines in your frequently revved thing, just say, look at NIST, and if it looks like this, you're good.
Yeah.
As opposed to the government, which we all know is reassuringly sure when they get something right. See also post-quantum cryptography. That only took us 3 years. But I mean, one of the things that we're also kind of fighting with this whole discussion is the idea that customers are trying to move away from using passwords. And you know this if you're running any kind of modern device, especially if you're in the Apple ecosystem, now that I'm getting the option to log in with Google on most websites, or Apple is now allowing the creation of things called passkeys, where I'm using biometric authentication and secure enclave on my device to authenticate to a remote site. Now, I know that there's some of you out there who are watching this. Adjust your tinfoil hat. It's a little crooked. I don't want somebody using my device to authenticate to people, even though it's technically two-factor because it's something you are and something you have, and it is secured on the device, and it's only transmitting the acceptance. I get it. You're not happy. And let's be fair, passkeys work about half the time as it is. One of the biggest problems is that passkeys can't move. And that was something that the FIDO Alliance literally just came up with, I think, yesterday. They said they're going to change the guidelines for passkeys to be able to allow them to move from device to device or move from system to system, which is good. And we've actually had great presentations from the FIDO Alliance at Security Field Day in the past, thanks to Intel. But do you feel that, and this is primarily consumer focused for most of you out there, like if you log into eBay, they want you to use a passkey now. Do you feel like passkeys are something that we could manage at the enterprise level, or is this kind of like consumer tech and ne'er the twain shall meet?
So that's a really good question, Tom. I think I'm looking at it from a consumer perspective in that they might be getting confused.
Okay.
Because there are in different organizations, there are different policies. Mm-hmm. And we have talked about complexity for so long, and now NIST is kind of backing off of that. And they're like, well, what is it you want me to do? What do you want me to do now? I'm just trying to figure this complex thing out. Now I'm getting to this. Now we're talking about passkeys. What is it you actually want me to do, and how do you want me to do this? And I'm going to different organizations. You do it this way. You do it this way. This organization wants me to log in this way. I think it's a lot for them psychologically to actually take on. So that's kind of my concern around that.
And I will admit that, Romeo, we've had this problem for years. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I was an intern at IBM, the guy who sat next to me in my cube, he had 4 different password expiration policies. One was like every 365, one was every 180, one was 90, and one was every 30. Every 30 days, he changed every one of his passwords to be the same so that he would only have to remember one password. So he was making himself more secure for all the wrong reasons and in all the wrong ways. But he was so tired, and he'd worked for IBM for decades by that point, but he goes, yeah, I just get too tired of having to change all the passwords at the same time. So I just make them all the same. And that way I know when 30 days is up, I just got to change one everywhere. I got a list here. So like, are we enforcing security and complexity and rotation guidelines to our detriment? Because everyone's seen the internet password logbook. By now it's almost a meme and a joke. But if I have to create a password that's so secure that even I don't remember what it is, I got to write it down somewhere. And if I'm not using a password manager, God bless anyone who's tried to talk their parents into using a password manager. Are we just creating more of a vicious cycle of, well, now it needs to be 15 characters long and have 3 special characters, and now I'm lost.
Well, I think that goes to a couple years ago, I was listening to a pen tester from Rapid7 give a speech about, how he gets into organizations and whatnot. And he said, most of you are going to ask me, well, what's the cool way that you got into the organization? He said, I really wish I got to get a cool way to get into organizations. He says 9 times out of 10, I can password spray using the month and year or the season and the year and get into just about every account just by adding an exclamation mark or a period at the end of the password.
Exclamation points are not ones, folks, or L's. Remember that.
Yep. So, we've created actually worse security structures than we were intending.
But we just need to see that little bar at the bottom of the screen fill up green that says that I'm safe, right?
That's it.
Yeah. Because if it's red, it's bad. Like we all agree, right?
So it doesn't say safe, it says strong.
Strong, which is a legal term, not secure, because secure implies that you're not going to get in trouble if you get hacked. But the password spraying thing is a good point, because that's one of the things that we've seen a lot recently is some more well-funded groups. We'll say that. Well-funded groups are basically trying to do this. Microsoft got slammed because they got sprayed. Someone found a service account that was not part of the password policy, because why would you put service policy or service accounts in your password policy? You should. And then they got hacked, and then they laterally moved all the way into the executives' emails. And oh my God, that was really embarrassing. But service accounts aren't part of the password policy because they don't get changed that often, right?
You have devices. And a lot of places don't even know what's on the network or who's accessing the data.
Mm-hmm.
So to manage it at an enterprise level, I think you need a little bit more than passkeys. And it also depends on the type of data that's being accessed. If you've got a password and explanation point to get on the network, not cool with that. But if it's my proprietary secrets, I want something a little bit stronger than that.
Yeah, some kind of system set in place where I can ensure that something's not trying to get into it. I mean, okay, this is the point of the discussion. We're going to talk about the Target POS hack. We're going to talk about the fish tank in the casino that got hacked. Like we've all heard of these. By this point, even though they really did happen, they're apocryphal because my God, they come up every time. And there's a lot of things like the zero trust people out there are probably going to be screaming, well, why was the fish tank able to talk to this casino's internal systems? Because people are lazy. But more importantly, why are we allowing these systems to sit there with accounts that have basically security problems? Because it's not just the service accounts on my enterprise grade equipment. Mm-hmm. Y'all aren't running consumer grade technology in your enterprises, right?
Hope not.
Hope not. Marion, why are you hoping not?
Because as I've gone into different clients, there is a different enforcement, and they do see complexity as being an issue. So, hey, we'll just go with what we've always been going with, and that's not following the NIST guidelines.
But I ordered this smart light bulb off of Amazon, and I need to be able to change the colors in my cube. It's totally secure, right? I can't tell you the name of this thing because it looks foreign, but it's totally secure, right? Because I got it from Amazon.
Oh, right.
And that's how Xiaomi cameras got turned into a giant botnet, is because it turns out they had a hard-coded root password. And Xiaomi is like, we're not changing it.
And unfortunately, the best way I could put it without we love the end user, but sometimes they want what they want and that's it. And I won't name obviously companies or places I've been, but I've been in healthcare and they're like, oh, by the way, did you see this new Amazon Echo we put in the corner? And I just want to scream because, again, HIPAA compliance, right. It doesn't matter what office it's in or what division, right? Be it from the healthcare side or just the general, HR, IT, legal.
Hold on. Back up the truck. We love the users.
We do.
I'm going to quote one of my co-interns from 25 years ago, Beth Limer. I feel like such a user right now. but that's the thing is hey, I put this wiretap device in the corner of our office where we talk about HIPAA stuff all the time. Doctors are trained. I don't talk about patient records in public because someone might overhear. And then you're like, hey, speaker, what's the weather outside today?
Yes.
But I mean, kind of going back to the fact that, we're relying on users to do these things. how can we make it easier for them to not have to jump through hoops with password policies, but also keep things relatively secure so that the auditors don't freak out?
Well, there's always consumer stuff on enterprise networks. I can think of like 3 exceptions out of thousands, but sometimes the consumer stuff is actually more secure than the enterprise stuff.
Because
like
it's revved more often.
with the Matter protocol, where all the IoT devices have like encryption and PKI and device certificates. So sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think most organizations, especially for IoT type things and users, is like there's not been a process. It was everybody just kind of went through life like this, and then suddenly there's all this random crap on the network. And some of the reports, there's a Run Zero report that said, through their analysis and scanning all the networks and stuff, like 64% of the devices on networks are unknown to the organization.
Yeah, it's shadow IT.
Yeah.
And anybody who loves to go hang out at Shodan will tell you that. And that's got its own problems in and of itself. But the fact that those are devices that have been cataloged, we know what they are. We know what the vulnerabilities are. I mean, you just have to Google, baby monitor admin password, and suddenly you have a portal into the system.
Yep.
Thank God we're not all nefarious, right? We're just trying to help. But a lot of people are putting these devices on their network, not understanding the interactions that they have with everything else. And I know that some companies out there like DigiCert are trying to fix this problem by doing things like certificate-based authentication for IoT devices. That way you know that if something goes haywire, yank the certificate off the device and now suddenly it's disabled. But that's expensive. On the best of days, that's expensive. The reason why I ordered this security camera from Amazon was because it was $30 and I want to figure out who's stealing the pens off my desk.
Well, no, the thing is, like you said, the prosumer devices, they tend to be more secure. They're auto-updating themselves. They're doing all the things now. Meanwhile, on our enterprise networks, we all have Johnson controls or their similar counterparts sitting on our network running Java from 1998 with a default password put on them because the HVAC guys don't understand what they're doing with this equipment. They just said, I need an IP address. And somebody said, okay, here's an IP address, put it on the network. And now this Johnson Controls device is there for life until it blows up or burns down in the fire.
Why is 3389 open to the internet? Well, we got to manage it and we don't want to have to go out there.
Exactly. So, I'm not worried as much about the consumer grade devices as I am the quote unquote enterprise technology.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because JJ brought up an interesting point that new protocols like Matter have a lot more enforcement in how they do these kinds of things, that it's required to be an encrypted channel and all this other stuff. I wonder how it got like that. What suddenly made a company decide to enforce encryption in a standard? Anybody know?
Well, it's not just encryption. It's like it's using certificates for authenticity and integrity.
Do you know where Matter came from?
I do, but I don't know where you're going with this. What?
Matter was very heavily based on HomeKit.
Oh, okay.
And it turns out that the reason why HomeKit acts the way that it does is because somebody in Cupertino said, you let people authenticate your IoT devices. How? Like, think of the number of devices. Like, go to Amazon right now and look through the list of devices. I promise you there's 2 classes. There are the ones that support Google Home and Amazon Home, and then there's the ones that support all 3, HomeKit, Google, and Amazon. The ones that support all 3 are a little bit more expensive because it turns out HomeKit support is not easy, but it's very secure once you get it built in. The rest of it, it's a crapshoot. And so when they built Matter, because Apple signed on to Matter, they're like, minimum says it has to be like this because this is what we support. And by design, I'm sorry if I just triggered all of your devices at home. I'm actually not that sorry. But the thing is that a company, an organization, a group said, this is the must minimum. So this goes back to NIST again. NIST is the authoritative source for governments, and that's it. When are we going to get to a point where an organization finally caves in and says, we are going to follow the NIST guidelines, not, it might be a good idea if we do?
Only after they get hit and, they start paying,
But really? I mean,
that's usually how that works.
Did Target change their password policies after that POS hack?
No.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's a separate story.
Right,
I would
right.
love to dive into, but I think that the more exposure they get with how lousy they're on their systems and their policies, then there's going to be added pressure to change that. And sometime in the future, the word compliance is going to pop into the conversation and governance, and I think it's going to be better, but it's going to take a significant amount of time until we get there.
So who drives compliance and governance?
So within the organizations, I mean, obviously there are the roles responsible for doing that, but I think that what we covered in, I would say in the last few minutes is the gap between we know that it needs to be done. We know that we need to get better. We just don't see why this is urgent. We just don't see why we need to do it right now. And I think the accelerators every single time is those incidents.
Mm-hmm.
And that incident has to impact the bottom line that they start losing revenue or money. Because if I have a breach or a compromise or something happens, but there's not a hit to my reputation, people keep coming back to my store. Things keep happening, then I can just keep doing business as usual. And I might impact this password policy, or I might do something, but there's no impact to revenue. I can just keep it going.
And that's the problem where some organizations, like I even just put it in the live feed, like NIST set the standard. We all know that. But how many of these organizations are they truly following it? Because what happens is they're not going to act on it and they're not going to do anything unless they see revenue loss. But then there's also the factor of word of mouth, right? Like, do you want your business to be impacted? Like, it shouldn't. We know as professionals, but I guess I could look at it from both sides, as a professional practitioner and then from the consumer. Like, if I hear you've been breached once, like, that's a no for me, right? But then if this keeps happening multiple times and repetitiveness, it shouldn't take money to be lost. It should also just take the safety of your consumer and the care and the quality. And unfortunately, again, this is just my opinion, I feel that's just been so lost. That's it. It comes down to dollars and cents. They don't care. They don't care. Oh, well, hey, there's been, how many data breach emails I get, from your, student loans. Like, they don't care. They're caring about, their bottom line. And I understand it's a business.
But that's the thing, Gerard, is businesses don't have feelings. Businesses are not altruistic. The safety of my users has a dollar amount attached to it, and it's called liability. So as long as my users are safe, they can't sue me or be forced into arbitration.
Well, I think we are so desensitized to data loss attacks, whether it's the end user, end consumer, or even us as security professionals. And I think the financial loss is still far from being substantive enough for organizations to change their behavior. It has to be very serious for them to change operational procedures, investments, whatever it is. So I look at this as, we don't want to tilt at windmills and say, how do we lock down and protect all these devices? It's more of a zero trust. This is going to happen. It's going to keep happening. And maybe it's going to get better, but it's probably going to get worse. So your investment has to be in protection. It has to be in response. And it has to be in assume that this will happen, because it will. I mean, it's not going away.
True.
I feel like one of the sticking points is that I just did a podcast about Marriott that they had 3 breaches over 6 years, and now the FTC, or I think it's the FTC, is like, we are now mandating you have to put these security controls in place, and we are going to monitor you for 20 years to make sure you're actually doing it. So government agencies are finally like, I just got to take you by the scruff of the neck and make you do it. Part of the problem, though, is that Marriott's not in the InfoSec business. They're in the hotel business, right? Part of the problem is that they are trying to work with a tech stack that has a lot of crappy software. It's hard to integrate. It's hard to operate. And Marriott can't go to name your favorite vendors and say, your product sucks, and I have to do this because of you, because of the liability protection that the vendors have. And until that changes, I don't think security gets better.
I think it's like credit card loss. We have an acceptable amount of loss in our society.
What these companies do when they get breached is put out a press release and say, the security of our customers is our top concern. Everybody knows it's a lie.
Free credit monitoring.
But again, the issue is, yes, they do have a duty of care to take care of their customers, but they shouldn't have to be like InfoSec ninjas to do that, right? The problem is that the products they are trying, if car manufacturers or aircraft manufacturers operate at the same standard as IT vendors, nobody would get in a car on a plane, right?
Well,
So,
some do, but that's a different.
Sorry,
Well,
common
Boeing,
sense ain't
but-
so common. I've been
But-
saying that a lot. But
Well, I mean, the flip side of that argument is if these companies didn't store so much damn data about me, they shouldn't have anything to worry about protecting. But
Right.
that isn't an argument for an entirely different roundtable. Let me say this though, because like you mentioned, the government is actually a really good example of this. I will refer back to one of my greatest professors, Dr. Tracy Cart, when she said that the best way to motivate people are fear and greed. Fear of the government stepping in and basically being shoulder surfing you for 20 years is great. Greed is another good example of. I wonder how many of these companies that have been breached recently have filed for a cyber insurance claim.
Marriott, I believe.
That
probably.
I think they did with
and you know what the funny thing is?
If they're not following the NIST or whatever the minimum requirements are, then
Who sets the minimum requirements?
the insurance company,
And do you think the insurance companies have done that?
yes.
Yes.
They have now
Absolutely.
because it
No,
used
no,
to-
no.
Yeah.
They've been doing that. They,
Well,
and
they-
they just keep adding stuff.
But originally they didn't. They thought it was the Wild West because it was like, hey, we'll just get all these insurance premiums and we'll never have to pay out. Oh my God, we're paying out. And I don't know if you guys know this or not, but I'm going to tell you a little secret of the universe. Insurance companies don't like to pay. They're going to do everything they can to get out of it. Ask me how I know later. But what's important is if there is a thing in the guidelines that said you must follow the NIST password the most current version of the NIST password policies, and you didn't, we're out. Like we don't have to pay that. You're using greed as a motivator because what happens? Either we're not going to insure you, so you have to go to some other company to do it, or we'll cover you for 3x the premium because we know you're probably going to get breached and we're going to get our money out of you before you get breached. I promise you, there isn't a CFO on the planet that won't authorize some crazy IT spending to get that premium down because lower numbers on the CFO's sheet mean that the CFO gets to keep their job. And then the security team gets new toys to play with. They're like, oh, we finally get to change password policy. You know, it can be more than 15 characters. How great is this?
Or the actuaries at the insurance companies have figured out what the number is, where the premium is more palatable than the security investment that the company has to pay, because the company knows they're going to get breached anyway. So which is the smaller number? If it's insurance, they'll go insurance. They're not going to invest in more security.
And you know they know that number. It's stored in a COBOL database somewhere, but they know. but that's the challenge, right? Is that we're balancing these things. As people, we want our users to be as safe and secure as possible while still being able to do their jobs. And every time we hit the roadblock of, do you know how much that costs? Do you know how long that's going to take to implement? Why don't we just let it ride? And if we get hit, we get hit. But this isn't a situation of like, here's a good example recently. Do you know that you can buy a car today from a dealership, choose not to pay $200 and not get a spare tire with your car? That is a thing. You have to elect out. They will chop $200 off the bottom line and you don't have a spare, not like a full-size spare. I'm talking you don't have a donut. And the reason for that, as nefarious as it sounds, is that saves shipping costs because the car weighs less. So they're passing those savings along to you. And it is a great idea in theory to save $200 on a $40,000 car until you get a flat tire. Now you're probably sitting out there thinking to yourself, I don't have to worry about this. My insurance company covers roadside assistance. You're right, they do, if it is in your deductible. And if you've seen what it costs to get roadside assistance in some of the really hairy places out there, you're lucky if AAA doesn't just laugh at you.
when you're sitting there on the side, you'd be like, man, I really
wish I had
that damn donut.
$200 less in my pocket and a donut in my car. But we're starting to see those kinds of things where people are trying to balance these decisions and companies are giving them an out by saying, sure, we'll lower your premiums if you do this. Or if you don't want to do this, we will gladly charge you a little bit more money. Just sign down here on the bottom line where it says that we're going to make you assume all of the liability for this problem. So is there any way that we could possibly reform these companies and get them to stop being money-grubbing jerks and get them to actually start thinking about the users?
No.
That's quick.
correct answer.
So
I don't
I've got a question for you, Tom.
I don't think they need to worry about the users.
Why?
Because ultimately, if you keep digging into the why, the users aren't the why. Right? The customers and the ecosystem and the economy is the why. Because ultimately, when these companies get breached and they have to pay fines, as the consumers, we're paying more for that ultimately.
Eventually, yes.
Yes.
That cost does get passed on to us.
Which is why I think the government is stepping in, and we've got SEC has new reporting regulations, even on the federal side.
Oh, yeah?
We've got CERCIA reporting regulations for CISA. So
it's
happening.
It's the same thing. It's always when your teenagers break the rules, you have to set new rules and you have to be strict about them, because guess what? Teenagers will continue to break the rules, just like the companies will continue to prioritize profit over people. Ben, you had a question.
Well, so thinking about this, how many of these companies that have gotten breached in recent years that we've all gotten our extra year of free credit reporting on?
My grandkids have free credit monitoring, right?
Are part of, are under, or, are subject to some framework, whether it be PCI DSS or whatnot, and they're still getting hacked. When do we get past the check boxes? Because honestly, PCI compliance, a lot of companies, they find the auditor that will just go click, 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 to actually having some sort of teeth to where PCI can actually say, you certified that you were PCI compliant, but you weren't doing this, you got breached, here's your $1 million fine. Then we can maybe start getting some of this stuff changed.
But the checkbox mentality pervades password policies, right? It needs to be a minimum of 8 characters. It needs to have at least one capital letter, one special letter, or one special character and a number. So what's to stop me from doing, like password 1, password 2, password 3? Some systems are set up to notice that the entropy between those two passwords is not unique enough. And let's be fair, if your password ends in a 1 at one point, I'm going to try all the rest of those digits, right?
Yep.
But it ultimately comes down to, for me, that a lot of these organizations that are subject to these frameworks are following the guidelines, but in the immortal words of the IRA, they have to be lucky every day. I only have to be lucky as an attacker once.
Yep.
All right.
Well, okay, hang on though.
Go ahead. There we go.
There's always this, it's easy to sit back on the throne, right, in the ivory tower and go, oh, well, why don't they just do this? How long would it take you to log into every application and look through all of the accounts and all of the passwords, password policies and profiles, and all of the exceptions, and document all of that? And then by the time you think you might have gotten finished with what you knew about, it would be time to start back over again. We don't have good tools for a lot of these things. And it's the forgotten password that somebody that was using this thing that then left, and there was some, root password that bypassed other things, or a system account, or a service account. It's hard.
We need a better
agree with
auditing
that.
tool to be able to pull that data and then ingest it, and then I'll use that word automate. We should be able to automate. Okay, here you have a 30, 60, 90, because that's just it. If you're still trying to manually do it, it's dated. We don't have that kind of bandwidth or time, or even dedicated security teams.
I think that's why we're seeing more and more emphasis on automated pen testing.
Yeah.
Because you can pay a pen tester from name your entity to come in once a quarter, once a year, once every 7 years when a cyber insurance company tells you have to do it. But things change in between. Whereas we've got some customers now that are running their pen test using an automated tool every 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks they're getting a list of stuff, and their security team is going out and going after that. And yeah, it's not going to find everything, but if you keep iterating enough, you're going to get better at least.
So that's really what it's about. Continuous, right? You mentioned earlier around when are we going to stop with the checkboxes? Well, it's always going to be a point in time if you choose to do a pen test or anything else like that.
Yep.
But the continuous and active monitoring. And when I say continuous, I mean, it would take you a long time to go through that cycle over and over again. But when folks get overwhelmed and just say, I'm not going to do it, that's really a problem. If you can continuously take a look at your network, like you were mentioning, on a regular basis, at least you'd have more information rather than just looking at it once a year.
So I'll close with this, because it's important that we understand that this is not just a point in time kind of thing. This is a massive undertaking that requires constant attention, and no password policy is ever going to be perfect. And you know what? As humans, we're not perfect either. AI is not going to solve this problem for us anytime soon. We're going to find exceptions. We're going to find things that violate the policies and the rules, whether they're updated or not, and we have to deal with them when we find them. We have to draw that line and say this far and no further. But when we draw that line and we fix the problem, we must fix the problem. Not should, not shall, must.